Hello and welcome to Philosophy Bites. We are going to be looking at Bentham and Mill on utilitarianism applied to IVF and euthanasia. So, this is the hedonic calculus mnemonic. A mnemonic is a memory trick. So there's the 7 characteristics of the hedonic calculus. I'll just go through them. Purity, uncertainty, propinquity, which means nearness, intensity, duration, fecundity is a domino effect of pleasure or pain, and extent. This can be remembered by pure utilitarians promote intense delights for everyone. Hope that makes sense. Now, this is where it gets complicated. This is where I'm going to go through each phrase from starting from left to right, top to bottom, and then you're going to write 3 paragraphs using as many terms as possible. Right, so we start off with the philosopher who's very famous for being a utilitarian is Jeremy Bentham. So we start off with talking about Bentham, and Bentham lived in the 1800s, and he's very famous for a thing called the Poor Laws. He wanted to, because there was lots of industrial revolution, the industrial revolution was going on. He wanted to go into to make laws to try and make factory conditions better, things like that, and help poor people out. The hedonic calculus is to do with working out pleasure, how much pleasure and pain is caused by an action, because Bentham's formula is the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. The appeal of utilitarianism is that pain or pleasure is natural. It's not. Bentham says, fact, we like pleasure. Fact, we dislike pain. And that's also empirical, because it's like the senses. So he was trying to, without thinking about God, he was trying to make morality scientific, so that you can actually study human nature and study what causes people pleasure or pain, and then work that into the formula. Utilitarianism is a teleological ethics rather than deontological, because it looks at the consequences of the action rather than the action itself. And in relation to that, it's a means to an end. So the means to the end of your action is the means to the end of maximizing pleasure. So we've already kind of talked about positive utilitarianism there. Negative utilitarianism takes the opposite view, that rather than maximizing pleasure, you should concentrate on minimizing pain. So think about euthanasia with that one when we come on to euthanasia later on. The idea of making the law to pass the law to make people have living wills, for example, could help reduce pain and suffering. So here's the hedonic calculus. The first bit of the hedonic calculus is intensity. I don't need to go into that. Propinquity is to do with the nearness in time. So how soon after the action is the pleasure going to be? Is it really far away, or is it a long-term plan or a short-term plan? Fecundity is like, think of Captain Tom at the minute, for his reaction to the coronavirus has had it's had a snowball effect of positivity, with him raising more and more money every day, and then Michael Ball getting involved and going to release this record. It's so positive for the NHS. So fecundity is where you have almost like a domino chain effect of pleasure, or if you do the wrong thing, a chain effect of pain. Purity, my example for that would be alcohol. You enjoy drinking on a night and you feel pleasure, but the next day you get a hangover. So there's a payback with certain things, like taking illegal drugs, for example. Uncertainty, fairly straightforward. How certain are you? How predictable is this action? Because often we do things and we don't predict the consequences. So utilitarianism is trying to predict the consequences. And that obviously the government at the minute with the coronavirus is trying to predict the consequences of having lots of vaccinations, for example, the consequences of making people wear masks. There's an uncertainty about all these things. Duration, that's fairly straightforward. One example for that would be, if you have sex, you should make it last rather than just be kind of wham bam, thank you ma'am. Extent, how many people are affected. So the more the merrier. Act versus rule. Well, Bentham's hedonic calculus is act. Rule is, like, take for example euthanasia. Imagine that they made it a rule, a law, that everybody that wants euthanasia should be able to have it. So your rule is you make the law, then you stick to that. You stick to that rule. Whereas act, you take each individual situation separately and then work out what to do. So act's almost more impractical. Rule is kind of how our government works in a way. They have certain rules and laws that supposedly promote pleasure or prevent pain. Oh, I've said negative and positive utilitarianism already. Sorry, that's on there twice. John Stuart Mill is the next philosopher. He was into rule utilitarianism. He also talked about higher and lower pleasures. Taking this from Aristotle, Mill thought that the purpose of a human being, the telos of a human being, is to exercise rationality. And he thought that rationality, if you're exercising rationality, you'll get much more pleasure than if you have a lower pleasure. Like lower pleasures is like kind of sex, food, drugs. Those are lower pleasures. They're kind of animalistic pleasures. So Mill, following Aristotle, thought that reasoning was you'd get more of pleasure with like things like reasoning and spiritual practices. Mill was really into taking long walks. He thought that taking long walks and reflecting on philosophy was a higher pleasure. So maybe it's a bit elitist. Some people would say that. Hedonism. Hedonism is the original kind of philosophy that we should pursue pleasure. Ethics as a science, using observation. Well, we mentioned it's empirical before, so that's how philosophy works, really. From a teleological perspective, this follows Aristotle again. Aristotle believed in observation. Hedonism's on there again. Sorry, Epicurus. He's the Greek philosopher that came up with the idea of the hedonism, although it's quite different to Bentham's version. Active euthanasia is where you deliberately give somebody drugs that will end their life. So you will terminate their life using maybe morphine or something like that, and a poison. IVF means in feturalization. We're going to talk about that in relation to Bentham and Mill, because one of the things about IVF, and this is to do with the hedonic calculus that we mentioned before, is uncertainty. You've only got, it's kind of like an unpredictable chance, and some couples go through IVF again and again and again and suffer as a result of that. So maybe some utilitarians will be a bit skeptical about IVF because of the uncertainty of it being successful. Selling embryos, well, is that ethical? Is it ethical to sell your embryo? Well, maybe the utilitarians would argue that yes, because the person selling the embryos is gaining some money, so they're getting pleasure from that money, and then the couple who adopts the couple who gets the embryo implanted obviously will be happy if it goes to full term. Sperm donation, there's the same thing with that. You could talk about is it a good thing to have anonymous sperm donors? Should people be able to find out that their dad was a sperm donor and find out his name? So think about that. Should children that find out that they were created using IVF or whatever with a sperm donation should be able to find out who their dads are. Passive euthanasia is where you kind of sort of let someone die, really, rather than actively kill them. And that goes on in hospitals all the time. My dad was actually asked the other day, because he's like one of the high-risk patients for the coronavirus, he was asked by his doctor if he wanted to be resuscitated if he started dying of it. So think about that in relation to rule utilitarianism, maybe rule utilitarianism, act utilitarianism. What would it say about passive euthanasia? Negative utilitarianism can come into it as well, because it's about relieving suffering. The same applies to turning off a life support machine. Is that just morally justifiable? So that you can use a life support machine for somebody else, maybe that needs it more. There are many issues in terms of who deserves the bed. How do you choose that? Do you choose it on utilitarian grounds, on who's most medically most likely to survive? Gay couples using IVF would be another issue. Do you think that children will experience less pleasure in having a gay couple rather than a heterosexual couple? And intrinsic value. Well, utilitarianism is about instrumental value. Utilitarians believe things are a means to an end. If you're bringing in Kant or natural law as a contrast to utilitarianism, then you could talk about whether things should have an intrinsic value or whether they should have an instrumental value. So, good luck with that. Thank you for watching. If you like what I've been doing, please post a like, and I'd welcome any comments that people would make about utilitarianism. It's a fascinating theory, quite complicated to know all the different versions of it, but hopefully with the mnemonic that's on the other slide, that will help you to remember the hedonic calculus. And the best thing you can do is give it, like I've tried to do in this discussion. I've tried to give you examples. Don't just think this is a theory. Think about it practically, because if you show practical examples, then the examiner is going to say this student really knows what they're talking about. They're not just theoretical. They actually see how utilitarianism can be applied to action, and often is in governments. The governments might not say they're utilitarians, but they are. That's how governments tend to operate, basically following utilitarianism. Certainly nowadays, anyway, not necessarily in the ancient world. So, hope you've enjoyed it. Bye.